Ethan lived far away from the noise of the city, deep inside the thick green jungle where tall trees stood like guards and the sound of birds was the only music. He was known as the Lumberjack, a man who spent his days chopping wood, carrying heavy logs, and living a life that most people in the modern world could never imagine. To him, the forest was not just a workplace, it was his home, his comfort, and his only companion. His small wooden cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by piles of cut logs neatly stacked like walls. The cabin was simple, made with his own hands, with a roof of strong timber and a chimney that gave out thin smoke whenever he cooked. Inside, there was little more than a rough table, a chair, a bed made of thick blankets, and shelves where he kept tools and a few books that had grown old with time. The cabin spoke of a man who needed very little to survive, yet it also carried the weight of his loneliness. Every morning, Ethan rose before the sun, when the sky was still painted in dark blue and the mist floated above the grass. He would sharpen his axe, sling it over his shoulder, and walk into the jungle with steady steps. The trees were his company, the sound of his axe striking wood echoed like a heartbeat in the silent forest. Sometimes he would hum a tune, sometimes he would simply listen to the call of wild birds, and sometimes he would pause to take in the beauty of sunlight breaking through the thick branches. But as strong as his body was, Ethan's heart often felt heavy. He had no family living near him. His parents had passed away long ago, and he never married. The few friends he once had in the village drifted away, moving closer to towns or cities where life was easier. Ethan had chosen the forest, and the forest had chosen him back. Yet the price of that choice was silence, long nights with nothing but the sound of crickets, long days with no one to share his thoughts with. He sometimes spoke to himself, just to hear a human voice. Despite his solitude, Ethan was respected by the villagers who lived a few miles away. They would often buy wood from him or hire him to cut down old trees. They called him reliable, honest, and hard-working. Children would look at him with wide eyes, seeing him as a man of great strength who could carry logs heavier than a horse. But when those people went back to their homes, filled with laughter and family chatter, Ethan returned to his cabin, where the fire burned quietly and the shadows stretched long. He had grown used to the loneliness, but there were nights when it pressed against him harder than the weight of any log. On those nights, he would sit by the fire and remember his younger days. He once dreamed of traveling, of seeing cities, of meeting new people. He once hoped to fall in love, to build a family, to hear the sound of children's footsteps in his cabin. But dreams fade when survival takes over. The forest became his only partner, and he learned to live with it. Yet deep inside, a quiet longing remained. He never said it out loud, but he wished for someone to share his life with, not for riches, not for luxury, just for companionship. Someone to ask him how his day went, someone to smile when he returned from work, someone to fill the silence with conversation. The jungle around him was both beautiful and dangerous. Wild animals roamed freely, storms could fall without warning, and paths were easy to lose. Ethan, however, had mastered the ways of the forest. He could tell the time by the position of the sun, predict rain by the smell of the air, and find his way back home by the sound of the river. To outsiders, it was a dangerous place, but to Ethan, it was a map written in a language he understood well. Sometimes, travelers passed through the forest, either for adventure or because they had lost their way. They often asked him for directions, and he would guide them with patience. Some offered him money, which he rarely accepted. For him, helping people in the forest was natural after all, he knew how unforgiving it could be to someone unprepared. But most days, no one came, and Ethan lived alone with the trees. The nights in the jungle were the hardest. When the wind howled and branches creaked, the shadows inside his cabin seemed alive. He would sit by the fire, staring at the flames, listening to the lonely echo of his own breath. Sometimes, he would read one of his old books, their pages yellow and fragile. Other times, he would carve small wooden figures with his knife, creating shapes of birds, animals, or faces that reminded him of people he once knew. These small acts gave him comfort, but they could never replace the warmth of real company. One evening, as the sun sank behind the thick line of trees and painted the sky in orange and gold, Ethan stood outside his cabin and watched the horizon. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the ache of longing, the ache of knowing that tomorrow would be the same as today. He sighed, picked up his axe, and returned to his work, for work was the only thing that kept his mind steady. Little did he know that life was about to change. The jungle, which had always given him wood, solitude, and silence, was preparing to give him something unexpected, something that would alter the path of his lonely existence forever. The night was darker than usual. Heavy clouds covered the moon, and the forest seemed restless. The wind rushed through the tall trees, making them groan and sway like giants whispering secrets. Ethan had just finished his supper of bread and soup, and he was about to put out the fire when he heard something unusual. At first, it was faint, so faint he thought it was just the sound of the storm playing tricks on his ears. But then, it came again, a cry, weak and trembling, carried by the wind. He froze, his body tense, his sharp ears focusing. It was not the call of an animal. It was not the sound of a bird. It was the sound of a human voice, fragile, desperate, and pained. Ethan stood up quickly, grabbed a lantern, and stepped outside into the night. The rain had begun to fall, thin drops at first, then heavier, until the ground turned wet and the air filled with the smell of fresh earth. He listened again, holding his breath. The cry came once more, this time clearer, from the deeper part of the jungle. Without hesitation, Ethan picked up his axe not as a tool, but as protection and walked toward the sound. His boots sank into the muddy ground, and branches whipped against his arms, but he pushed forward with steady determination. He had lived long enough in the forest to know that ignoring such cries could mean leaving someone to suffer, or worse, to die. After what felt like endless minutes of searching, his lantern light fell upon a shape near the roots of a fallen tree. His heart beat faster. He moved closer and saw her, a woman lying on the wet ground, her clothes torn, her face pale, and her ankle twisted in an unnatural way. She looked weak, her lips trembling as if she had no strength left to speak. Ethan knelt beside her. "Can you hear me?" he asked in his calm, deep voice. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting his. They were tired eyes, filled with both fear and relief. She tried to speak, but her words broke into whispers. "Help, please," those two words were enough. Ethan did not waste time. Carefully, he lifted her into his strong arms. She was light compared to the logs he carried every day, but her fragility made him cautious. She winced in pain as he moved, and he whispered softly, "Don't worry. You'll be safe soon." The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual. The rain poured harder, soaking them both, but Ethan did not slow down. His boots splashed through puddles, and the lantern flickered in the storm, but he kept moving with steady strength. The woman's head rested weakly against his chest, her breathing uneven. Each step made him more determined to save her. When they finally reached his cabin, he pushed open the door with his shoulder and laid her gently on his bed. The warmth of the firelight fell on her face, revealing cuts and bruises. Her hair was tangled with leaves, and her clothes were marked with dirt, as if she had been wandering for hours or maybe days. Ethan quickly lit more wood in the fireplace, letting the cabin glow with heat. He removed a clean blanket from the shelf and wrapped it around her trembling body. Then, he checked her ankle. It was swollen and red, clearly sprained. From his small cabinet, he took out herbs and bandages he always kept for emergencies. Carefully, with hands both rough and gentle, he cleaned her wounds and wrapped her ankle to keep it steady. The woman opened her eyes again, her voice still faint. "Thank you," Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "Rest. You're safe here." He offered her warm water to sip, then placed another log on the fire. The storm outside roared, but inside the cabin, there was shelter, warmth, and a strange new presence that Ethan had not felt in years. For so long, he had lived in silence. Now, there was someone else breathing under his roof, someone who needed him. Throughout the night, Ethan stayed awake, sitting in his chair beside the bed. He watched over her, making sure the fire stayed alive, making sure her breathing stayed steady. She drifted in and out of sleep, whispering broken words that revealed little. Sometimes she called out names he did not recognize. Sometimes she just groaned in pain. Each time, Ethan adjusted her blanket, checked her ankle, or gave her water. Hours passed. The storm finally began to calm, and the jungle outside grew quiet again. Ethan's eyes grew heavy, but he refused to leave her side. He thought about how strange life could be. He had spent years in the forest without anyone knocking on his door, and then suddenly, in one stormy night, fate had placed a stranger in his care. As dawn broke, the woman stirred again. She opened her eyes and looked around the cabin, confused. Her gaze landed on Ethan, who sat nearby, still watching. She tried to sit up, but pain stopped her. Ethan moved closer. "Don't try to move," he said firmly but gently. "Your ankle needs rest." She gave a small nod, her voice weak but clearer than before. "Where am I?" "You're in my cabin," Ethan replied. "I found you in the forest last night. You were hurt." Her eyes softened with gratitude. I I thought I wouldn't make it." "You will," Ethan assured her. "You're safe now." Silence filled the room for a moment, broken only by the crackle of fire. The woman looked at him with curiosity, as though trying to understand the kind of man who lived alone in the middle of a jungle and would rescue a stranger without hesitation. Ethan did not ask her questions yet. He could see she was too weak to explain. Instead, he busied himself with preparing food. He cooked porridge on the fire and offered it to her, spoon by spoon, until she had eaten enough to gain some strength. She thanked him again with tired eyes, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. That entire day, Ethan cared for her like he would care for a fragile bird fallen from its nest. He changed her bandages, gave her water, and let her rest as much as she needed. Whenever she opened her eyes, she found him near, silent but dependable. She began to feel that she was not just rescued, she was being guarded. For Ethan, the day felt different from all the others he had known. His cabin, once filled only with silence, now had the sound of another person's breath, the faint rustle of movement, the soft voice of gratitude. It was strange, yet comforting. He did not know who she was, where she came from, or how she ended up lost in the jungle. But one thing was certain: his life of loneliness had been interrupted, and it was only the beginning of something far greater than he could imagine. The days slowly began to pass, and the woman started to regain her strength. Her ankle was still swollen, but with Ethan's careful bandaging and rest, she could sit up and move a little without as much pain. Ethan kept her company in silence most of the time, speaking only when needed, but his actions spoke louder than words. He cooked for her, made sure the fire never died out, and checked her wounds every morning. She noticed the way he moved, quiet, steady, and without a hint of complaint. Every task he did, from cutting logs to boiling water, was done with patience. There was no rush in him, no hurry to get things done. Life in the forest had made him calm, like the old trees around him. At first, the woman spoke very little. She seemed shy, almost guarded, as though she was unsure of how much to reveal. She told him her name Claire, but nothing more. Whenever Ethan asked simple questions like "Where were you headed?" or "Do you live nearby?" she would only shake her head or give vague answers. Ethan did not press her. He knew that some people carried stories too heavy to tell right away. Instead, he gave her time. His quiet presence slowly made her feel safe, and little by little, she began to open up. One evening, as the fire crackled and the sound of insects filled the night, Claire finally started to talk. She told Ethan that she had been traveling in a small private plane. Something went wrong during the flight, and the aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing near the forest. In the confusion, she had gotten separated and wandered alone, searching for a way out, until exhaustion and injury brought her down. Ethan listened without interrupting. His eyes, sharp and serious, stayed on her as she spoke, and when she finished, he simply said, "You were lucky to survive." She gave a soft smile. "I think I was lucky that you found me." Those words warmed Ethan in a way he didn't expect. For so long, he had believed his life had no greater purpose than chopping wood and surviving the days. Now, for the first time in years, he felt that his presence in the jungle had truly mattered. Claire began to notice the details of Ethan's life. She saw how carefully he stacked his wood, how neatly he kept his tools, and how even though his cabin was simple, it was strong and built with skill. She admired the discipline in his routine, waking early, working hard, and living without complaint. It was so different from the world she came from, where people relied on machines and luxuries to live comfortably. Sometimes, when Ethan sat quietly sharpening his axe or carving small figures out of wood, Claire would study him. His face carried lines of hardship, but also a quiet strength. His eyes seemed to reflect the forest itself, deep, steady, and filled with silence. She wondered how a man could live so alone for so long. One morning, while Ethan was preparing food, Claire finally asked him, "Why do you live here all by yourself?" He looked at her, surprised by the sudden question, then went back to stirring the pot. "This is my home," he answered simply. "Yes, but don't you ever feel lonely?" she pressed gently. Ethan paused. His hands stilled for a moment before he continued working. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the forest is honest. It gives me work. It keeps me alive. I've learned to live with its silence." Claire's heart softened at his words. She could feel the weight hidden behind his calm tone. She realized that the man who had saved her was not just a strong lumberjack, he was also a human being carrying years of solitude in his heart. As the days turned into a week, Ethan and Claire grew more comfortable around each other. She began to laugh softly at times, and he, though not used to laughter in his cabin, found himself smiling more often than before. She told him little stories about books she had read, places she had seen, and the world outside the forest. Ethan listened with quiet curiosity. In return, he showed her the secrets of the jungle, how to light a fire with dry leaves, how to tell which fruits were safe to eat, and how to listen to the call of birds to know if danger was near. Through these moments, they both discovered something new. For Claire, it was the beauty of a simple life, free from the noise of wealth and society. For Ethan, it was the warmth of companionship, something he had forgotten could exist. Still, Ethan could not help but sense that Claire was hiding something. She carried herself with grace, even when tired or in pain. Her words, her accent, and the way she looked at things all hinted at a life very different from what she described. He did not ask, but deep inside, he knew there was more to her story. One evening, as the sun set in a sky painted with purple and gold, Ethan sat outside sharpening his axe. Claire slowly limped out of the cabin with the help of a stick he had carved for her. She joined him, sitting on the wooden step. "Ethan," she began softly, "I haven't told you everything." He glanced at her, but his face remained calm. "I figured," he said simply. Claire let out a small laugh at his honesty. Then her expression grew serious. "I didn't just happen to be in that plane. I come from a very different world. My family is wealthy. In fact, people call me a millionaire. But I never liked being defined by money. That's why I wanted to travel. I wanted to see life beyond mansions, parties, and endless responsibilities. I wanted to breathe freely, away from the cages of luxury. Ethan's hand stilled on the axe. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. A millionaire? He had never met one before, nor had he ever imagined rescuing one in the middle of a stormy night. Claire continued, her voice softer now. I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't want you to see me as someone made of wealth. I wanted you to see me as just a person, someone who got lost and needed help. And you treated me exactly that way. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't a name, or a title, or a fortune. I was just Claire. Ethan took a long breath. His rugged face remained calm, but inside, a storm brewed. He wasn't angry, just surprised, maybe even a little uncertain. What place did a man like him, a simple lumberjack, have in the story of a woman like her? But he did not let his doubts show. He simply nodded and said, it doesn't matter who you are outside this forest. Here, you're just someone who needed help. And I'd do it again, no matter what. Claire's eyes softened, and for the first time, tears filled them, not from pain, but from the comfort of being understood. She reached out, her hand brushing against his rough fingers. Thank you, Ethan. That night, as they sat by the fire together, something had shifted. The secret was no longer between them. The distance between a millionaire and a lonely lumberjack had grown smaller, replaced by respect, trust, and a strange bond that neither of them had expected. The forest outside was silent, but inside the cabin, two souls who once belonged to different worlds now shared the same warmth. Neither of them knew what the future would bring, but for that moment, they both felt less alone. The days in the jungle took on a new rhythm. Ethan, who had lived for years in silence, now found his cabin filled with soft voices, gentle laughter, and conversations that warmed his heart. Claire's presence had changed everything. What once felt like endless stillness now felt alive. Each morning, Ethan still rose early, as he always had, sharpening his axe and stepping into the forest to gather wood. But now, before leaving, he checked on Claire, making sure she was comfortable. Sometimes, she would already be awake, sitting by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders, waiting for him to return. She smiled at him, and that simple smile gave him more energy than food ever could. As her ankle slowly healed, Claire tried to help with small tasks around the cabin. At first, Ethan refused. You need to rest, he would say firmly. But Claire insisted. She wanted to be useful, not just a burden. So she began with light chores, washing the wooden bowls, sweeping the floor with a handmade broom, or folding blankets. Ethan watched her with quiet amusement. She wasn't used to such simple work, her hands were soft, her movements sometimes clumsy. But she was determined. One afternoon, when Ethan returned from chopping wood, he found Claire outside the cabin, sitting on a wooden stool, carefully peeling vegetables for supper. She looked up at him with pride. See? I'm learning. Ethan chuckled, a sound rare from him. You'll be a forest woman soon. Claire laughed, her eyes sparkling. Maybe not yet. But I like this life more than I thought I would. It surprised Ethan to hear that. Most people from the outside world complained about the jungle, its heat, its insects, its dangers. But Claire seemed to find peace in it, as though the forest gave her something she had been missing all along. In the evenings, after supper, they often sat together outside the cabin. The jungle was alive with the sound of crickets, frogs, and owls. Above them, the sky stretched wide, filled with stars brighter than any city lights. Claire would sometimes talk about the places she had visited in her past, grand hotels, glittering parties, and travels across countries. Ethan listened quietly, amazed at her stories but never envious. To him, her world sounded like a dream too far away to imagine. Then it would be his turn. Claire would ask about his life, and though he was not much of a storyteller, he shared pieces of his past, how his father had taught him to work with wood, how his mother's cooking once filled their home with warmth, and how, over time, the people he loved drifted away, leaving him with the forest as his only companion. Claire listened with kindness. She never pitied him, and that made Ethan comfortable to speak. He realized she was not like other people he had met. She didn't look down on him for his simple life. In fact, she seemed to admire it. One evening, as they watched the fire, Claire said softly, "You know, Ethan, you have something most people don't. You have peace. In my world, people chase wealth, power, and fame, but they never find peace. Here, in your cabin, I feel something I've never felt before: freedom." Ethan turned his gaze toward her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Freedom?" he asked. "Yes," she said with a nod. "Freedom from expectations. Freedom from noise. Freedom from pretending to be something you're not. Out there, I always had to play a role. Here, I can just be myself." Her words stayed with Ethan long after that night. He realized that while he had always thought of himself as poor in company, poor in luxury, he was rich in something else, the quiet strength of simplicity. And perhaps that was what Claire had been searching for all along. As her ankle grew stronger, Ethan began teaching Claire survival skills. At first, she protested, saying she could never be as strong as him. But he was patient. He showed her how to hold a small axe to chop kindling, how to collect dry leaves for fire, and how to tell which plants could be used for food or medicine. The first time she managed to light a small fire on her own, Claire clapped her hands with delight like a child. "Look! I did it," she exclaimed. Ethan allowed himself a rare smile. "Not bad," he said, though inside he felt proud of her determination. Together, they explored the edges of the jungle. Ethan never let her go too far, not until she was fully healed, but even those short walks were enough for Claire to feel the magic of the forest. She admired the tall trees, the colorful birds, and the hidden streams that sparkled under the sunlight. With Ethan guiding her, she no longer feared the dangers of the jungle. Instead, she saw it through his eyes as a home, not a threat. One afternoon, while they rested near a stream, Claire turned to him and asked, "Ethan, have you ever thought of leaving the forest? Of going to the city?" He shook his head slowly. "The city isn't for me. Too crowded, too noisy. Here, I know who I am. Out there, I'd just be lost." Claire nodded in understanding. Yet deep inside, she wondered what would happen when her world eventually came looking for her. She knew that people must be searching. Her family, her friends, even the authorities. They would not rest until she was found. That thought gave her both comfort and fear. Comfort, because she knew she would not be lost forever. Fear, because she wasn't ready to leave this quiet life or the man who had saved her. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Claire and Ethan grew stronger. They no longer felt like strangers. Their conversations became warmer, their silences more comfortable. Sometimes, they didn't need to speak at all, just sitting together by the fire was enough. Ethan began to notice the change in himself. He laughed more, he spoke more, and at night, he no longer felt the same crushing loneliness that had haunted him for years. Claire's presence had filled a hollow space in his life, one he never thought could be filled. For Claire, the change was even greater. She had entered the forest as a wounded stranger, carrying the burden of wealth and identity. But in Ethan's cabin, she was just Claire, a woman who could cook, laugh, stumble, and learn. She found joy in the simplest things, stirring soup over the fire, folding freshly washed blankets, or walking with Ethan under the starlit sky. Yet both of them knew, though unspoken, that this peace would not last forever. Claire belonged to a different world. A world that would eventually knock on the cabin door. But for now, they chose not to think about it. For now, they chose to live each day as it came. Claire continued to heal, and Ethan continued to teach. Together, they built memories that neither of them would ever forget. The lonely lumberjack was no longer lonely, and the millionaire was no longer trapped by her title. In the heart of the jungle, two lives from opposite worlds had come together, creating a bond stronger than the tallest trees. The morning sun filtered gently through the trees, painting golden streaks across the forest floor. Birds sang their cheerful songs, and the jungle seemed calm after days of heavy rains. Inside Ethan's cabin, the fire crackled softly, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Claire sat at the small wooden table, her ankle almost fully healed now, while Ethan prepared their meal. Life had fallen into a rhythm, and both of them had grown used to each other's presence. But deep inside, Claire knew that this peace could not last forever. Her family and the outside world were surely searching for her. The thought filled her with mixed feelings. She wanted to see her family again, yet the idea of leaving Ethan and the quiet life they had built together made her heart heavy. That day, as they shared breakfast, Ethan noticed her silence. "You're thinking about something," he said in his steady voice. Claire looked at him, her eyes soft. "Yes. I keep wondering when the world will find me. I know people are searching. They won't stop until they do." Ethan nodded. He had thought of the same thing many times. He had even seen planes flying overhead recently, a sign that search teams were likely combing the forest. "It's only a matter of time," he said quietly. Claire lowered her gaze, her fingers playing with the wooden spoon. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back." Ethan studied her for a moment. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to leave, that she could stay, but he kept those words inside. Deep down, he feared that her world and his were too different. What could a lumberjack offer to a millionaire heiress? Still, he also knew that their bond was real, stronger than wealth or status. Later that afternoon, while Ethan was splitting logs outside, the distant sound of engines broke through the jungle's silence. Claire stepped out of the cabin, her heart racing. A helicopter was flying above the trees, circling as though searching for something. She and Ethan exchanged a look. This was it. The moment they had both known would come. Ethan placed his axe down slowly. "They've found you." Claire's chest tightened. She should have felt only relief, but instead she felt a deep ache. She turned to him and said softly, "I don't want to leave you, Ethan. Not after everything." Ethan's voice was calm, though his eyes betrayed the weight in his heart. "Claire, your family needs you. You belong to a different world than mine." She stepped closer, shaking her head. "No, I belong where I'm understood. And you're the only one who has ever seen me for who I really am, not for what I have." Before Ethan could respond, the helicopter descended nearby, and voices shouted through megaphones. Searchers rushed through the trees, calling her name. Claire's heart raced as she realized the separation she had dreaded was now at her door. The rescuers reached the cabin quickly, their eyes widening when they saw her alive and standing beside Ethan. "Miss Claire. Thank heavens we found you," one of them exclaimed. They explained that her disappearance had been on the news for weeks, and her family was desperate to bring her back. Claire looked at Ethan, torn between the two worlds standing in front of her. She knew she could not ignore her family's love and worry, but she also knew she could not leave behind the man who had given her life new meaning. When she finally left the cabin with the rescuers, Ethan stood quietly at the doorway, watching. He didn't try to stop her. He simply gave a small nod, as if to say, "Be safe." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she was guided toward the helicopter. Before stepping inside, she turned back and called out, "Ethan. This isn't the end. I promise you." The helicopter lifted off, carrying her away, and Ethan stood in the clearing, the wind from its blades whipping through his hair. His cabin, once filled with warmth and laughter, fell silent again. The old loneliness crept back, but this time, it felt different. Because unlike before, Ethan now carried memories of a woman who had changed his life. Days turned into weeks. Ethan went back to his work, chopping wood, cooking meals, living in rhythm with the forest. Yet every corner of his cabin reminded him of Claire, her laughter, her voice, her presence. He missed her deeply, but he did not regret anything. Saving her had given him purpose, and knowing her had given him hope. Then, one afternoon, as he returned from the forest carrying logs, he noticed something unusual. A car, shiny and expensive, was parked at the edge of the clearing. And standing beside it was Claire. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart leaping in his chest. She was dressed differently now, in clean clothes that reflected her wealthy world, but her eyes carried the same warmth. She smiled at him as he approached. "You came back," Ethan said, his voice low with disbelief. "I told you this wasn't the end," she replied. She walked closer, her steps filled with determination. "Ethan, I went back to my world, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back to pretending. I realized that the only place I felt truly alive was here with you." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Claire, your world is full of comfort, wealth, everything I can't give you. Why choose this life?" She looked at him firmly. "Because wealth doesn't matter if the heart is empty. I've had mansions, parties, and all the luxuries anyone could dream of. But none of them gave me what I found here: a man who sees me as a person, not as a fortune. I'd rather live in a cabin with you than in a palace without love." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had never thought himself worthy of such words, yet here she was, standing before him, choosing him over a life of riches. From that day on, things changed. Claire decided to divide her time between her responsibilities in the outside world and her life with Ethan in the jungle. She brought supplies to make his life easier: medicines, better tools, books, and even fresh seeds for planting. But she never tried to change him. She respected his simple ways and lived alongside him, learning and growing together. The villagers soon came to know Claire too, not as a millionaire, but as the woman who stood beside Ethan, helping him carry wood, cooking in his cabin, and smiling at everyone with warmth. People admired the unlikely pair: the wealthy woman and the lonely lumberjack who had found something far richer than money, companionship and love. As time passed, Ethan's cabin no longer stood as a symbol of solitude. It became a home filled with two lives intertwined. The forest still echoed with the sound of his axe, but now it also echoed with Claire's laughter, her voice, and the life they shared. Ethan, who once thought he was destined to live and die alone in the silence of the jungle, discovered that fate had a different plan. And Claire, who once believed her wealth defined her, learned that the greatest treasure she could ever find was hidden deep in the forest, in the heart of a humble lumberjack. Their story became one of transformation, not of riches or poverty, but of two souls who found each other in the most unlikely of places. And though the forest remained wild and unpredictable, inside that small wooden cabin, there was peace, warmth, and love strong enough to outshine the loneliness of the past.